Ours is a story of two worlds, separated by time and distance, but linked by parallels which span across history. The two worlds, Vietnam and Iraq. We turn now to the endgames of the wars which took place and compare Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization to the withdrawal of troops from Iraq.
The root of most of the actions of the time really is social pressure. In both cases, that is, in Iraq and Vietnam, the fighting had dragged on far longer than the populace had hoped, and American casualties were on the rise. During the late 60s, student protests continued, while in the 21st century, the internet provided a new platform for protesters. All of this anti-war sentiment built and pressured for a reduction in U.S. military presence overseas.
It was this pressure that influenced the decisions of the political leaders of the times. Nixon entered the Vietnam War after Johnson under the slogan, "Peace with Honor," promising the public an end to the lengthy war. Withdrawal during the Iraqi War took place under Presidents Bush and Obama.
You see the same patterns of thought emerging in both sets of presidencies. At first, there was a strong resistance to any actions that might be seen by the rest of the world as signs of weakness.
In January, I could only conclude that the precipitate withdrawal of all American forces from Vietnam would be a disaster not only for South Vietnam, but for the United States and for the cause of peace. For the South Vietnamese, our precipitate withdrawal would inevitably allow the communists to repeat the massacres which followed their takeover in the North 15 years before. For the United States, this first defeat in our nation's history would result in a collapse of confidence in American leadership, not only in Asia, but throughout the world. 3 American presidents have recognized the great stakes involved in Vietnam and understood what had to be done. In 1963, President Kennedy, with his characteristic eloquence and clarity, said, "We want to see a stable government there, carrying on the struggle to maintain its national independence. We believe strongly in that. We're not going to withdraw from that effort. In my opinion, for us to withdraw from that effort would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but Southeast Asia. So we're going to stay there." President Eisenhower and President Johnson expressed the same conclusion during their terms of office. For the future of peace, precipitate withdrawal would be a disaster of immense magnitude. A nation cannot remain great if it betrays its allies and lets down its friends. For these reasons, I rejected the recommendation that I should end the war by immediately withdrawing all of our forces.
These patterns are evident in both the early actions of Nixon and Bush. Both found, however, that mounting casualties and social pressures eventually forced them to begin withdrawing troops from overseas. Nixon planned out what he called Vietnamization, while Bush worked through a status of forces agreement, or SOFA. Obama furthered Bush's work when his administration created Operation New Dawn.
In Robert McNamara's film, The Fog of War, McNamara outlines 11 lessons that he wanted the world to learn from the Vietnam War. Lesson number 10 best describes Nixon and Bush's views towards their respective wars. Never say never, McNamara tells us. Both Nixon and Bush originally claimed that they would not retreat, not show weakness, but their resolution was not to be.
What both Nixon and Bush found was that a hardline attitude could not be upheld in a changing environment. Their resolve weakened, and they fell back from their harsh ideals.
We have offered the complete withdrawal of all outside forces within 1 year. We have proposed a ceasefire under international supervision. We have offered free elections under international supervision, with the communists participating in the organization and conduct of the elections as an organized political force. And the Saigon government has pledged to accept the result of the election. We have not put forth our proposals on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. We have indicated that we're willing to discuss the proposals that have been put forth by the other side. We have declared that anything is negotiable, except the right of the people of South Vietnam to determine their own future.
Several plans were enacted by the various presidents to pull troops out without leaving the overseas nations without support. Both Vietnamization and the 21st century plans included details and instructions for training the natives to defend themselves.
Nixon's plan was really quite simple. By training the Vietnamese people, he could effectively remove U.S. troops without having an overall negative effect on the war. While this didn't work in practice, in principle, it was a clever technique.
The Vietnamization plan was launched following Secretary Laird's visit to Vietnam in March. Under the plan, I ordered first a substantial increase in the training and equipment of South Vietnamese forces. In July, on my visit to Vietnam, I changed General Abrams' orders so that they were consistent with the objectives of our new policies. Under the new orders, the primary mission of our troops is to enable the South Vietnamese forces to assume the full responsibility for the security of South Vietnam. Our air operations have been reduced by over 20%. And now we have begun to see the results of this long overdue change in American policy in Vietnam. After 5 years of Americans going into Vietnam, we are finally bringing American men home. By December 15, over 60,000 men will have been withdrawn from South Vietnam, including 20% of all of our combat forces. The South Vietnamese have continued to gain in strength. As a result, they've been able to take over combat responsibilities from our American troops.
Bush first set out to withdraw troops with his Status of Forces Agreement. In Article 24 of the document, it is written, recognizing the performance and increasing capacity of the Iraqi security forces, the assumption of full security responsibility by those forces, and based upon the strong relationship between the parties, an agreement on the following has been reached. The document continues to outline a removal plan of U.S. troops. President Bush had recognized the need for a formalized statement of withdrawal. President Obama furthered this goal by replacing Operation Iraqi Freedom with Operation New Dawn, which dramatically changed the focus of the Iraqi missions.
So tonight, I am announcing that the American combat mission in Iraq has ended. Operation Iraqi Freedom is over, and the Iraqi people now have lead responsibility for the security of their country.
What, then, were the supposedly dramatic effects of these policy changes? Did the U.S. government succeed in its goals? Did it, as McNamara so admirably put it, maximize efficiency?
A quick look at the numbers is quite telling. Nixon began practicing Vietnamization soon after March of 1969, which lies directly at the end of this plateau here. Nixon's policies really did reduce the number of troops. On the Iraq graph, Bush's SOFA came into effect in November of 2008, which lies here. It is clear that the troop levels began to fall at this point, and while we have yet to see the effect of Obama's New Dawn, which has been set into place only recently, it is surely only a matter of time before it too lowers troop levels. As for the question of efficiency, a simple look at the number of civilian casualties after the plans became enacted shows that the deaths in fact began to fall off after the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
The Vietnam situation ended with tragedy for many. North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam soon after President Ford stepped into office, and economic depression struck the country. Many would call Vietnam a failure. What, then, does the future hold for Iraq? Will it fall as Vietnam fell, without the support of the U.S. troops? Or will the Iraqization process protect civilians from harm?